an increase of almost $1.8 billion from our 2022 actual receipts. We did in 2022 include, for quick recap, extraordinary transfers to Capers Trust Fund and to the Budget Stabilization Fund. The 23 tax only estimate is about $300 million, or 3.1% greater than the 22 actual receipts. For 24, the total receipts for the first time, I believe, ever, we went in our estimates above $10 billion, $10.1 billion. It's an increase of an additional $423 million, or about 4.4% above our new 23 estimates. Really, one of the biggest drivers in our estimates was the present and immediate future impact of inflation. It was really pretty impactful, and the main driver in a lot of this. But that is fairly certain in the near future. But in the further out, we look, the more of an impact that a downturn in the economy could create some reductions in tax receipts. But we did go ahead and not reduce them, as we talked about earlier. We do have GDP going up, and we'll talk some more about that in a little bit. And virtually all of our tax sources are going up if we don't adjust them for current law changes that were made. Calendar 22 has seen the highest levels of inflation in several decades, and it's the sharpest monetary policy response to inflation in that same time period. Inflationary pressures result in higher nominal receipts, which is the amount going forward, due to the purchases of more expensive items, which brings in additional sales tax receipts. And as salaries increase, it also increases withholding and income taxes. The larger the impact of inflation for the short term, the more uncertainty there is in the long term. Interest rate increases by the Fed will result eventually in some cooling of the economy. It could eventually have some adverse effects on the economy, as we had talked about. However, both the extent and timing of that slowing growth is difficult to predict and creates, like we talked about, uncertainty. But the group remained cautiously optimistic for state receipts in the near term, but do have some questions about the longer forecast period. Talked a little bit about GDP for 22. Some of the indexes that we use, we increased inflation by 3.9% to 8.5% in 22. We decreased the real Kansas GDP by 1.4% to a positive 1.3%. And we increased the nominal Kansas GDP by 2.6% up to 9.8% for 22. Then for 23, we increased inflation from our previous 3% up to 5%. Real GDP, we decreased 1.2% from 2.3 to 1.1. And we increased the nominal GDP for Kansas from 5.2 to 6.1. And the national numbers are pretty close to the same projections we used here. The Kansas job market continues to show exceptional tightness with more job openings than unemployed individuals. And that ratio of unemployed individuals to job openings at this time is the all-time lowest level in recent months, with one unemployed individual for every 2 to 2.5 job openings. Consequently, Kansas employers are struggling to re-add jobs that were lost during the pandemic, with 82.6% of all jobs and 87.9% of private sector jobs regained as of September 2022. The forecasted unemployment rate, which has been below 3% for most all of the year, we are projecting that to go up to 3.5% in 2023 and 3.6% for 2024. And both of those are consistent with full employment, which is normally considered about 4%. The agriculture sector of the Kansas economy faces some significant headwinds. Inflationary pressures for agricultural products production, those input costs have been even higher than the economy at large, and persistent drought conditions throughout the state have really limited the farmers' ability to take advantage of those higher commodity costs or prices that they've been seeing with those increased input costs. Though the export sector really is looking as a bright spot. We're projected to have excess of $5 billion for the second time ever. The first year that it was over $5 billion was last year. We are projecting them farmers to have a positive income for 22, but it's expected to be below both 21 and then those long-term historical trends. Gas and oil. We did have some spiking over the summer. Those are now in a new forecast to remain at similar levels to the previous estimate. Kansas crude is at $78 a barrel for 23 and $65 a barrel for 24. The previous estimate was $77 for 2023. And for 22, the actual was about $76.95. With that stability at a still fairly high level, we're calling for smaller declines in oil production. We're expecting 28 million barrels in 23 and 27.5 million barrels in 24, which is down slightly from the 24 million that we had in 22, but well above previous expectations. Natural gas prices have increased to $5.50 per MCF in 23 and to $4 in 24. The average for 22 was $4.31. We had previously forecasted $4.20 for 23. In manufacturing, after really several years of challenging outlook, the current outlook for manufacturing economy has improved since the latest forecast or the previous forecast. The 737 MAX for Boeing is flying again, and companies are replacing the old aircraft with concerns about the environmental and fuel efficiency. So it is creating a larger demand for aircraft and aviation materials. And additionally, the demand for business jets has rebounded from the decline from the pandemic as well. One thing that does really push back on that is the strength of the dollar, which is pushing those costs up for exports. We did take into consideration the tax policy and other bills that were passed. The group members reflected food sales tax. We reflected that reduction from 6.5% to 4% on January 1st, 23, and then further reduced it to 2% in January of 2024. So that was approximately 84 million in 23 and about 270 million in 24. The estimates also reflect the 0.5 percentage point reduction in the corporate income tax rate with the Apex legislation and development going into effect. We projected that to happen in January of 2024. Excuse me, in tax year 24. We reduced receipts a total of $104 million across the two fiscal years for Apex. About 25 million of that was in the current year. So those are the things that we did include. Quick overview of what we were looking at, and a lot of this will be coming out in the long memo shortly. Do want to, once again, as we have to do, because we can't do this without all these people, thank them for all of the work and effort that was put into providing background information, and everybody that was sitting at the table providing those estimates. Those include the Department of Revenue, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor, the Pooled Money Investment Board, Department of Insurance, oil and gas industry, of course, our university economists, and then the staff of the Division of Budget and KLRD. So we really did want to thank everyone for the hard work and information that was provided. That's kind of the background information. Then we have handed out the short memo. As you can see, for 2023, we increased the total receipts by $794.2 million, or 8.9%. And then taxes, we did increase by $773 million. For 24, on top of that increase, we added $423 million in 24 for the total state general fund receipts. The tables then, table 1 and 2, reflect the individual changes that we made. Did I leave anything out? Probably.
I don't think we have any questions to answer, so probably not. No, I do want to echo JG's comments related to everybody's help and assistance in getting us here. While it is only JG and I at the table presenting these updates to you all, please know that there are no less than 40 or 50 people involved in getting us this information. The information that we use to develop these estimates is absolutely critical, and it comes from various points of view from various state agencies and folks even outside the state agencies. And candidly, the information that we receive books upon books upon books of information, and I find myself referencing these books throughout the year to kind of benchmark where we're going throughout the year. So I really appreciate everybody's involvement, and certainly appreciate the partnership with KLRD and all the others at the table. These estimates are consensus estimates. Everybody comes into the room with a different point of view, and we just kind of talk about what those points of view are and come up with the best estimate that we can. So as you're looking through, before we open up for questions, as we're looking through table 1, for example, if you look at the fiscal 24 versus fiscal 23, you'll notice that the taxes only increase that JG references is relatively flat. And it's only about a 0.9% increase in taxes only from fiscal 24 over fiscal 23. As JG has mentioned, though, we have baked in the impact from the AXA food tax and from some of the provisions of Panasonic into the 24 tax numbers. So it's, you could say, suppressed a little bit for that. So if apples to apples, we would have increased by several $100 million more in fiscal 24 than what you see on this piece of paper. But just by virtue of how we forecast, everything rolls into that line. That is to say that we do anticipate the real impact to be greater than 0.9%. A couple of highlights for me are on the real Kansas GDP. You know, there's a lot of talk about inflation and what the impacts of the economy might be, but and inflation is a concern and something that at the federal level they're working to tamp down and get under control. The Fed has been working on that. I think we're due for another CPI report tomorrow morning, if I'm not mistaken. I don't anticipate a whole lot of changes in the numbers that we've seen coming out recently. Probably still going to be somewhere in the 8% range, probably going to be driven by rent, food, things of that nature. But for us to be able to show 1.1% real Kansas GDP, which backs out the impact of inflation for 23 and 2% growth, or excuse me, 1.6% growth in 24, it shows that while we are baking in a slowdown of the rate of growth that we have been seeing, we still feel cautiously optimistic, as JG put it earlier, about where things are headed. So those are the highlights that I would provide. And I think with that, we'd be open to any questions that folks might have. And please, as you have questions, if you can turn your mic on so folks can hear that, we don't have to repeat it. That would be helpful.
John Hanna, AP. I think the comment was that inflation was the driver for the change in the revenue estimates. Explain that. I mean, I get higher cost of goods, more sales tax, people responding with higher salaries, but explain how much that is a driver.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, John. You're spot on as it relates to sales. There's absolutely a correlation there of, in higher inflation will lead to higher sales tax receipts. So if you back out the inflation, the sales growth that we see might be more like a close to negligible or 0% real growth. Again, real representing the nominal number less inflation. On the individual income tax line, something that the university economists have helped us with is they did some regression analysis whereby if you plot the Kansas nominal GDP over time and also plot against the nominal GDP in that same year what the individual income tax number, the correlation is nearly 1. The R squared they use is 94%, I think. So with nominal having inflation baked into it, and that certainly shows the individual income tax going up. And again, part of that, like you said, is wage growth has increased significantly over the past couple of years. So with higher wages, you're seeing higher individual income tax. And then on the corporate side, the corporate profit rates have been exponentially higher than what we've seen in a regular year. I mean, corporations, we're seeing profit rates in the close to double digits, where in a normal year, you're in the 3 to 4% range. So that all kind of rolls into it. I think I missed.
I asked the question because there's been some commentary that the state budget picture, which is, I think everybody agrees, vastly improved over where it was 5.5 years ago, that a lot of the rosiness of the picture now is inflation as opposed to good fiscal management or luck.
Yeah, I'm going to comment first and then let you jump in if you don't mind. I would push back on that to the extent that a budget is two sides of an equation, right? It's not just revenues. Revenues are certainly stronger right now, and it could be a combination of factors, and we're not going to be able to pin down to an exact percentile exactly what is driving which portion, whether it's inflation or job growth or new deals coming to the state or whatnot. But on the budget side, the budget itself has been stabilized. There's been a lot of work going in with the governor pushing policy, and certainly the legislature partnering on that with eliminating a lot of the debt that we have on the books and eliminating some of the budget gimmicks. So to the extent that we've been able to kind of stay on that course, the budget itself has become more stable and the revenues just continue to grow. So JG.
I was just going to comment on basically the same thing. Not only everything that Adam had talked about, but we haven't gotten into the next budget cycle where we will have to reflect the additional inflation increases on the expenditure side as well. So as we move through that, those are going to have to be readjusted as well. But yeah, there's been a lot of money put into the budget stabilization fund and ending balance and debt and capers. So I think that's helped stabilize a lot of the expenditures.
When Jason Tidd, Topeka Capital Journal, when talking about the impact of tax cuts, especially the Apex income tax cut and the food sales tax, was it roughly 700 million total in less tax revenue over the next 2 fiscal years, or was that all inclusive of all tax cuts passed in this last session?
Yeah, I don't believe we showed 700 million just for AXA tax and Apex over the next 2 fiscal years. I think we said in the neighborhood of $100 million of impact from Apex over the next 2 fiscal years, and certainly there will be more impact over the next couple of years as it's amortized over a 5-year period of time or 10-year period of time, depending on the type of tax credit. The food sales tax itself is about $90 million on the current schedule of the AXA food tax in fiscal 23, and about $70 million of impact in fiscal 24, again on the current AXA food tax schedule.
So roughly 460 million in those 2 tax cuts over the next 2 fiscal years.
I didn't do the math in my head as quickly as you did, but that sounds close.
Revenue-wise, the additional 794 million increase this year and the 423 million for the next fiscal year. So 1.2 billion. Any idea where that puts the budget surplus as of right now?
We can get that a little bit later.
Just, is somebody going to dump all that into a swimming pool and dive in at some point? I do have a question about these transfers and other receipts, since there's such a huge impact on the total receipts numbers. The fiscal year 2022, that is basically all the money that went into the budget stabilization fund and paying back. I can't remember what they were called. Was that the PMIB bridge loan in there?
That did happen in 22, yes, but there was the stabilization fund deposit, which is a revenue event. That's a transfer into that. There was a significant amount of money that went into Capers in fiscal 22. There was also an additional amount of money that went into Capers in fiscal 23. As you might recall, the 1.125 billion was spread over time with triggers in August and December to occur as well. So that's what the bulk of those numbers would be.
And so that's why we're seeing in fiscal year 2023, it drops to roughly 578 million, and then it goes down further just because those Capers payments are lessening.
Capers included, the budget stabilization fund included. So I would say probably the 300 million is closer to what our normal transfers would be.
Okay.
Governor's budget wise, are they going to be coming up with something on how they'd like to use any of this extra money?
Yeah. So, Governor Kelly's been pretty consistent, and she's put out there a lot of what her priorities would be in his second term. As you well know, she doesn't release her budget until January. So she and my team will sit down here in a few weeks and start actually putting it together. A few things that I can talk about that I can just about assure would be in there would be full elimination of the state level food sales tax as soon as humanly possible. Could be in as soon as April 1st. I think once you see the surplus numbers and the amount of money that we've added to the budget, you'll see that mathematically there is absolutely no reason not to be able to pull that policy forward into early 2023, especially with the inflation numbers that you're seeing related to food. Some other things that she's talked about doing is fully funding special education. Not sure what that policy is going to look like, but that's something that we'll sit down and talk about later this month and early in December. Adding diapers and feminine hygiene products to the food sales tax, and then also working to eliminate the Social Security cliff that occurs at $75,000. So those are some of the policies that she's talked about publicly over the last couple of weeks, and I assume that she'll want to sit down and talk about that when we actually put together the budget.
Is the $250 income tax rebate still in the mix somewhere?
I can't comment on that. Candidly, that was one of those things, John, we talked about last year that, as we wrapped up the budget, it was a remaining surplus, and it would have been a one-time rebate to residents once everything is paid for. Yeah, so I think the key for her would be the elimination of the food sales tax right away, because effectively that's a one-time hit. If you talk about eliminating it now, because the cost, the ongoing cost of the food sales tax elimination is already baked into the out years. So to pull it forward is just a one-time expense.
Any projections on what a second Apex project could do toward the corporate tax rate?
That sounds like a conversation for Lieutenant Governor Toland. That's really in his shop what Apex projects look like.
Martin Hoffer with Hoffer's Capital Report. Trying to think how to phrase this nicely, but CRE has been, $90, $100 million lower than we've actually taken in receipts for the last couple of years. Are you doing anything to tighten up that gap, or is there any way to do that? I keep talking to Republicans who say, the CRE puts out these numbers and makes the governor look great. Every month she gets, Is there a way to tighten this up, or is this procedurally, industrially, the way one does CRE?
I mean, we've looked at things in the past about different alternatives. I would say the biggest driver in the recent history is the inflation, and nobody was expecting it to go up to over 9% increase year over year. And when you look at a 9% increase in sales tax, and I'm just saying it's exactly the same, it's not. But when you reflect that type of an increase in income that's caught up with that, and the sales tax, the adjustments that corporate taxes have made, I mean, it's a difficult thing. And then with the amount of uncertainty that we have and tax law changes that go into effect, it gets really pretty difficult to put out a fiscal note on what tax cut is going to be, or how much those projections are going to increase, or going further back, decrease. I would say also that for the most part, and I probably shouldn't say this, but generally I think forecasters kind of are behind the trend. When things are going up, we tend to think, well, they're not going to continue to go up like that. And then when things are really declining, we tend to think, well, it's not going to decline that much. So I think between those two items, I don't think we had any thought that inflation was going to be over 9% when we did our estimates.
Is there a part of that when the estimates keep being exceeded, you just kind of put the legislature on a longer leash?
I'm not going to answer that question directly, but what I will say is this group, and it is a group, as I mentioned from the outset, of various agencies. We have legislative representation, executive branch representation, outside university economists talking to us. So we put forward the best estimate that we can. We know that our collective bosses, whether it's the governor or the legislature, use this as a foundation from which to budget. So it is incumbent upon us to put forth the best possible estimate that we can. You could say that undershooting the estimate and exceeding that every month is a good thing. I would argue maybe that leaves money on the table that somebody could have used to fund a critical service or do a more responsible tax cut. So our goal is never to be coming in over the estimate. We would love to see a day where we come into the penny on the estimate, and that's truly our goal every time. Well, I won't just waste this opportunity of awkward silence. I think it looks like all the questions are gone. So JG has one more thing.
Well, go ahead.
The blue ones.
Okay. Or we could have one piece of paper. We did put a very quick profile together on what would happen with our receipts, with our new estimates and expenditures. We did increase, we did adjust all of the expenditures for the latest consensus caseloads. So when we put in our current receipts of 9.7 billion and 10.1 billion for receipts, we adjusted caseloads for about 200 million, and that's primarily from the extended health emergency and the 6.2% state general fund increase that the feds gave us. And school finance, we had fewer pupils than we were originally thinking. And then for 24, we increased at 163 million for caseloads, and that's once again reflecting a lot of that health emergency going away, and then an increase of 225 million in 24 for school finance, leaving an ending balance of about 2.3 billion in 23 and 3.2 billion in 24, and that also maintains the almost $1 billion budget stabilization fund for those years, in addition to the 3.2.
Very good. Well, thank you guys very much. Appreciate the time.